everyone. Welcome to Humans on the Verge podcast. Second episode. Very excited. Very excited about today's guest. When am I not excited? But that's the whole point of having these people on my show, because I get to be excited about them. So I love that I'm talking to this person today. So I just want to give a little background and then a little introduction, and then we will jump in to this episode. For the last 30 years, since 1994, when Newt Gingrich introduced the Contract with America, the American political system has been a teensy bit gridlocked. The main tension has been between differences of opinion, generally, arising from the fact that some people are focused primarily on improving what's wrong, while others are focused on preserving what's right. Of course, that is very much a matter of opinion for both of those types. This tension actually is a good thing. It's what we Jungians like to call a healthy tension of the opposites. And that as long as there is an overall agreement about the common good, such as what is good for the country or what are the common interests as Americans, this is a good thing. It's a healthy thing. When there's an agreement about the common good, this tension can create a generative force that creates progress. But when there is no agreement about a common goal or a vision, democracy turns into basically a tug of war and what some call a vetocracy, a vetocracy. I'll get that word out.
President Fukuyama, I think he coined that.
Thank you. Where one side just denies any constructive or agreeable path forward because, well, it comes from the other side. Many see the pickle we are in as a country as a political problem and not as a cultural problem. Since the 1960s, when the counterculture emerged as a huge cultural force, we have lost the ability to foster political consensus. Progressive values emerged with this counterculture and ushered in the demise of traditional worldviews having the power to shape cultural conversations and trends. Today, America has again chosen a president that 50% of America loathes, and about 25%-ish adores, and another 25% are willing to tolerate him in hopes of getting some economic or other benefit from his policies. For the 50% that loathes him, they are thoroughly, and I mean thoroughly, confused about how anyone could vote for him because his stances and policies don't seem to align with their way of thinking about the world. And it seems that his power is built from a foundation of grievance and retribution versus one of building on foundational principles of our country. I'm thrilled about my guest today, Steve McIntosh, because he has a way of looking at all of this and unpacking it in a way that actually helps us understand what the fuck is going on. If you too are confused, frustrated, and in disbelief, my and Steve's hope for this conversation is that we can give you a very unique and, for me, a very satisfying big picture perspective here. On my former podcast, Waking from the American Dream, I had Steve and a few other folks on whose work is deeply informed by what is called integral philosophy. It is something I've been studying and practicing myself for around 20-ish years. And I'm excited to bring this way of seeing humanity, culture, the great evolution we're all trying to get involved with to you today. Steve McIntosh is a developmental philosopher who focuses on the evolution of consciousness and culture. And he is founder of a nonprofit organization called the Institute for Cultural Evolution. And he's the author of many, many books: The Presence of the Infinite, Evolution's Purpose, Integral Consciousness and the Future of Evolution, also co-author of Conscious Leadership with John Mackey and Carter Phipps. But his latest book is the one that I've been consuming lately, and I think every single page in line is underlined at this point. And it's called Developmental Politics: How America Can Grow into a Better Version of Itself. This book not only thoroughly explains why we are so gridlocked as a nation, but offers a unique path to help us move above and beyond all of that. So Steve and I are going to unpack this a little bit today and hopefully calm your nervous system down a little bit, open your mind, and definitely open your heart. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks very much, Kelly. It's an honor to be with you, and I appreciate you having me on the show.
I'm so excited you're here. I've been a fan of yours, as you know, forever. And as you probably saw, I was tweeting and blue skying or skorking or whatever the hell we do over there. Your book a lot the last 2 months, because it really did calm me down and remind me of what we're here to talk about. And I thought it would be essential for us to start with this kind of basic understanding of what this integral word means, why we use it, and talk a little bit about that in a general way, so our audience today can start to understand it a bit.
Sure. Well, integral philosophy is a school of philosophy. It goes by other names besides integral, but for this conversation, we can call it integral. It's a philosophy of evolution, right? Like that the fact that we now know over the past few decades, as we've come to understand not just Darwinian evolution, but the fact that the entire universe is evolution happening. This is obviously new truth that we haven't fully digested as a civilization. And so integral philosophy is concerned with the deeper meanings behind this revelation of evolution. But it goes beyond just looking at cosmological evolution or biological evolution. It looks at the term I like to use is noosphere evolution, made famous by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who's an integral philosopher in his own right. And the noosphere is the thinking layer. It's almost like understanding human history as a kind of evolution. It can't be reduced to biological evolution. It's not happening inexorably or through some natural selection, although there's some of those forces in play. When it comes to human history evolves by people trying to make their life conditions better, right? So it's not natural selection, it's actual selection. We're actually trying, to make it better.
Yes.
And so what does that mean? What does that look like, right? So there's a history here, like in the 19th century, there were all of these theorists of the evolution of civilization, and they were sort of egregiously Eurocentric and condescending, and it gave this idea that culture and consciousness are evolving a kind of a bad name. That's been rehabilitated in certain ways, but there's still not a consensus within the broader culture about what the development of human history means. So the idea that it's a kind of evolution, that's new, and that gives us what we think are new insights into what's happening and how we can participate in the further growth in a positive direction.
Yeah, and I think for me, like really what helped me see that are those two big markers that we talk about, which is the Renaissance, Age of Enlightenment, where this new type of thinking and seeing and understanding of possibly what reality is. And then this thing that happened in the 60s, which had been building for 60, 70 years or so, with, I think, the Romantics kind of coming in and other people. I think of like Carl Jung and Freud and talking about the unconscious and things like that. But the 60s really coming on board and there being another tumult, another thing that happened. And I think that really helped me understand, like, oh, we are expanding the way we look at humans and what humans are up to. And it's certainly one of the biggest things that I think helps in that is from those two kind of leaps we made is how humans start to include more and more people into the idea that we should care for them. Like suddenly there were the rights of man it wasn't perfect, trust me. And people complain about our Constitution not being perfect and all of that. But there was an idea suddenly now that was real to humans that like, no, everyone should have the rights, of equal rights to vote or property or whatever it is, that we all should have a fair shake. And then, of course, in the 60s, that really expanded to marginalized people and the earth itself. So that little bit is really helped me see like, oh, there has been an evolution for sure.
Yeah, that is when we talk about evolution, right? That is a term that is certainly in contention, right? The biologists want to, evolution only to stand for, descent with the modification of species. But I think there is generally an understanding that no, that the universe is in the process of becoming. And it's been becoming for 13.8 billion years. And in this becoming, something more keeps coming from something less, as far as we can tell. So there's the something more there's many ways to measure it, right? Some have tried to reduce it to complexity, but that's a very thin way of describing what's becoming in the universe. And so this recognizing that humanity is developing and that this something more keeps coming in the realm of human history, right? We're sort of taking up and building on the accomplishments of previous levels. And since the emergence of, hydrogen right after the Big Bang,
Yes.
There's been this sequence, right, whereby something keeps coming, and that sequence creates a structure, what I refer to as the structure of evolutionary emergence, right, or just the structure of emergence for short. And there are it's not linear. I like to think of it as a rising tide with waves at the front that are going back and forth. Yep. But when it comes to human history, we can see the structure of evolutionary emergence pretty clearly when we look at value systems, right? So that one way of thinking about, for example, even contemporary politics, is that at the surface level of politics, we have the candidates, right? And then right below that, we have the political parties. And right below that, we have the interests. And then at the bedrock level, there are values that are often hard for people to see, right? They see the other side merely for their interests and their conflicts. But at this bedrock level of values, in some ways, that's where we can really say that there has been evolution. That there's been an expansion in a variety of ways. There are many lines of development, right? Again, I want to make sure that people don't think I'm talking about this in some kind of linear progression.
Right.
However, one of the lines that we can point to as constituting authentic evolution in terms of progress in value over time is this recognition of how people, the scope of those who are worthy of moral consideration has gradually expanded, right? From the self to the family, to the tribe, to the nation state, and increasingly to all sentient beings. And it's pretty hard to deny that as the circle of care grows, that's not something good, right? Now, of course, that creates all kinds of new problems, and we don't want to just reduce it to that. But that is what's happening now is that there's this tug of war. You mentioned it at the beginning, this natural polarity that appears within every human polity to some degree. It's sort of indestructible, permanently recurring. And that is that there are some people who are more oriented to fixing what's wrong and others who are naturally more oriented to preserving what's right. And these concerns are interdependent, right? If you focus on one to the exclusion of the other, the ability of that pole, and they talk about them as poles, each pole can create value. But the value-creating ability of a concern over preserving what's right or conversely fixing what's wrong, that ability to make things better is determined by the moderating influence of the other, right? So a good example would be liberty and equality, right? If we just go for complete libertarian paradise of nothing but individual liberty, that's going to create some problems and some gross inequalities in society. But if we just focus on equality, we're going to get a totalitarian state, right? Because you can't create equality by fiat. So at least not for long. So these forces are interdependent. Ideally, equality needs to be challenged and supported by liberty and vice versa. And we can see many different manifestations of that indestructible polarity at the level of values. Understanding this, it's almost like a physics of value, the natural behaviors of values in the culture. Part of what validates this understanding is we can see this explanation that these polarities working themselves out in the course of human history in a very vivid way. And so while, we may recognize there's like conflict and tension and where there's decay and backwardness, but I would say there's also these forces of growth and forces of evolution. And I think the more we can see those clearly, the more not only can it give us hope for the future, but actually some techniques for making progress in our cultural situation.
And I think about those values of liberty and equality, just to bring them kind of back home a little bit, just within our own lives, because all these values you talk about, we have inside of us. And actually these tensions and these worldviews that we're going to talk more about, we have inside of all of us. Also, there's a way that I'm a conservative. I want to conserve what is right in the world. There's a way that I want liberty and opportunity and freedom and all of that. And then there's a way that I want to make sure that, everything is fair and equal and sorted, and distributed equally in some ways. And I think about my own tension within me about liberty and equality, that, you have to make and it's not a compromise so much, but you have to learn to, like you said, to play with each of these poles in such a way. And you kind of give some a little attention and a little fuel for a while. And then the system starts to get a little wobbly. Like I think about eating and wanting to be fit, right? It's like, yeah, I want the freedom to eat whatever I want and have as much eggnog during the holidays and sweets or whatever it is. But at the same time, I also have to measure my life and keep things in some sort of homeostasis inside of my body, and so there's always this constant the tug of war between, especially those two values. But I mean, and those are two big ones, certainly for our conversation and in America. I think what I find so interesting about this approach is, yes, the evolutionary part, and yes, seeing the values baked in to all of it. But it also helps me kind of sort through the information that's coming at me constantly through media. And the way that media and the popular culture wants to talk about all of this, it's very much tribal. It feels very tribal, the way we talk about it. It's us versus them. And certainly during the election, it gets even more tribal because you've got people parsing, this center GOP people that are the suburb people versus this, and and there's the progressives and the liberals on the left, and they're fighting, and then there's the MAGAs and the Christians and the money conservatives on the right. And it all can become very confusing for me. And I find myself like falling back into like, what's going on? It's so chaotic. But one thing I love about how you really parse this out in your book, and in general when we talk about this, are these kind of three main forces that are all kind of demanding their way or the highway. They don't tend to want to play well with each other anymore. Like I talked about, since Newt Gingrich, since the early 90s, we don't have this ability to kind of meet each other in a certain way. And of course, we're talking about like the traditional, some people would call them conservative Republicans in America. And then there's this kind of the more moderate Republican or even centrist Democrat, maybe. And then, of course, there's this progressive-y left that happens. How do you sit with with that and those kind of categories for our political and kind of cultural tribes?
Sure. Well, there's many ways to divide up, right, the different demographic categories or political factions. I mean, we could maybe identify 50 of them. But if again, we go back to this idea of the structure of evolutionary emergence in history and this idea of bedrock values, we can begin to see how the major events of human history are sort of imprinted on people's consciousness almost in an unconscious way today. So we can see in history that we going back to the Stone Age, right? They were mostly tribes and then early empires, but eventually, several thousand years ago, we have the world's great religions that emerge in many parts of the developed world, especially in the 5th century BC. That's kind of a turning point. And for thousands of years, the majority of people in the world lived within one of these religious civilizations that were organized typically around scripture, religious teachings, but had law and order and, a fairly complex society. But they were also all fairly feudalistic in their government structures, and there was your rigid class hierarchy. And there were all kinds of obvious limitations. If we look back now, we can say, well, certainly there were some beautiful things in the pre-modern period, let's call it that, that we've lost, right? Or that we still need, or that we can look back on with, a degree of affection. But we have an event that occurs. I mean, you mentioned the Renaissance. That's certainly a significant event. And then we have the Reformation. I mean, within European history, there's many steps along the way. But the big event, at least from this perspective of evolution, is the emergence of this modernist worldview, modernity as it's called. And it appears in Europe and the United States in the 18th century in what is known as the Enlightenment, right, or the Age of Reason. And that Enlightenment worldview has, since it emerged, with Thomas Jefferson, for example, is one of the avatars of modernity. And the United States is, in some ways, as a country, as one of the first democracies, is an exemplification of what changes when this new worldview, this new sort of octave of values comes online, right? So in some ways, the emergence of modernity can be compared to the Cambrian explosion in biological evolution, because the world changes, population goes like this, and the wealth of the world goes crazy, and there's all kinds of new problems, right? Gross inequality, nuclear proliferation, environmental destruction, right? So modernity creates new challenges that humanity's never faced before, and that gives many people apparent justification to condemn it and feel that we'd be better off if we were in the pre-modern period where things were easier to understand. Or some even argue that we should go back to a tribal, pre-literate kind of a culture.
Oh yeah, I've had that fantasy. Like, wouldn't that solve it all, Steve? If we could just all sit around a village and grow our own food again? Like, this is what communes are about.
Fallacy, But okay, so modernity emerges, right? We came online hundreds of years after it first emerged. But up until the 1960s, as you mentioned, modernism was still the dominant worldview for the American establishment. And while traditionalism, this religious worldview, that as modernity merged, it pushed off against the power of the church. And there was a dialectic tension between modernism and traditionalism, let's call it, as these large-scale structures. But gradually that tension got worked out, and then there was a kind of a cultural truce, especially after World War II. So from the end of World War II until the 1960s, what's known as the liberal consensus prevailed, and there was comity between the parties and a lot of cooperation within the government. But that situation was unsustainable for a variety of reasons. And why this next significant worldview? I mean, it's, modernity, so it's like the Cambrian explosion. So that which comes after modernity, the postmodern worldview, which is the best term for it, I think, it pales in comparison to the evolutionary significance of both, these religious civilizations that are thousands of years old and modernity, which has changed the world forever. However, because modernity is not sustainable either environmentally or culturally, right? In other words, a
Yeah.
lot of its use comes from, we're sick of the oppression of religion, but once we break free from religion for some, centuries, eventually we have to look around and say, well, is this all there is? I mean, is it just we're like seeking status and material possessions? Is that really what life's about? People yearn for deeper meaning, and they don't want to go back to religion, or at least received religions, to find it, right? So this quest for deeper meaning and the dissatisfaction with modernity's unsustainability gives rise in the 60s to this countercultural worldview, which since then, over the decades, has gained cultural power. It still lacks political power, but has formidable cultural power because it's managed to, at least have a big beachhead within the major institutions, especially, universities and media and nonprofit sectors. So we now have a situation in the United States and elsewhere in the developed world where we have three worldviews online, right? Still, probably 30% of America still has a cultural center of gravity, right? They might use modern technology, they might have a good education, but when it comes down to what they really believe, it's based in the loyalties to religion, which is, has its own beauties and its own pathologies, right? Then we have this modernism, still the mainstream, right? People still look to science for answers, and they still care. They still care about their upward mobility. I mean, the values of modernity are still strong in the United States, probably half, 50%. But then over the decades, as I mentioned, now probably 20% are in this discrete worldview, which identifies itself kind of as an antithesis to modernism. Right? Whatever modernism is about, it's sort of the values of this postmodern worldview are arrayed against it, right?
Yep.
So whether it's capitalism or religion or environmental degradation, there are many things that these are sort of points of departure that allow. Another way of thinking about it is, as people grew up in middle-class America, with everything modernity had to offer already, right? This kind of search for a deeper sense of value was what has driven this several generations now, not just the baby boomers, but the generations that have come after. Many of the brightest have embraced this postmodern worldview, but we can't reduce this to a cartoon version. It's not a stereotype. These worldviews have ideologies within them. They have conflicts within them, right?
Yeah.
So the progressive postmodern worldview, it includes anti-racism, the environmental movement, the New Age spirituality. It includes many different factors that are not all perfectly aligned. But what does give this worldview a membrane, a cultural structure that people can invest their identity in, is that almost everything that's in this postmodern culture, what binds these people together is their condemnation of modernity, right?
Yes.
That whatever modernity stands for, they're against it, and the whole idea is that we're going to transcend modernity in history. That's very important. We have to transcend it. However, postmodernism is not the end of history because it does a good job of breaking out of modernism and providing a critique of modernism, but it's for a variety of reasons, including its political impotency, because it's rejecting the rest of the society. It can't get the rest of society to agree with it, and it wonders why people don't like them, right? I mean, serving a very important function because taking the first step.
Yes.
But again, it's not the end of it, and the structure of emergence is continuing. And the horizon of history, what comes after progressive postmodernism, right? That's what this integral philosophy is all about, is trying to identify the next emergent stage of history, what its values will be. We can't just claim it by fiat. It's not something we just make up like a New Age fantasy.
Right. We can't just write it on a board and say, that's what we're doing now. Yeah.
Well, our opportunities for evolution are partially dependent upon the problems that we're confronting at this time in history.
Yeah.
And one of the major problems we're confronting is that these three worldviews are at loggerheads to each other, and it's making our democracy highly dysfunctional. And we're not going to meet in the middle, right? That horse is out of the barn. We're going to have to grow out of it. So what does growing out of hyperpolarization looks like? That's what my work is about, at least part of it.
Yeah, Steve, that's great. And when you were talking about this traditional to modern to postmodern, I was thinking literally about my father in that moment, because I think about, he was born in the 30s, and, he grew up he was a young boy, late 30s. He was born 37. And so he was a young boy through World War II. And then, by the age of 10, it's that kind of post-war boom is happening. And he's getting all the benefits of that stability and living in New York City. And, he was grew up in a kind of a working class neighborhood and everything like that, but really bright, right? And so felt all of that, and also saw the choices given to him. His mother wanted him to become a businessman. She worked in advertising. She really wanted him to have that suit and that career, that modern madman career. And he was someone who loved comedy and jazz, and obviously was an artist. And when I see his choices in his 20s, when he started doing his work, some of his earliest stuff was really comedy about the media. He was already commenting about modernism and materialism and the American dream and the media and how the media sold it, advertising in particular. And so there was already this pushback inside of him. So he really was this member of that early counterculture, looking for meaning and knowing this is all bullshit. I mean, later in his career, he had a whole show called, It's Bad for You. It's all bullshit and it's bad for you, But, and so he was one of those people, but at the same time, he loved his new BMW and his Apple computer. He was a man who loved his modernism. In fact, he even did an amazing beat poet thing called I'm a Modern Man, which, is kind of all about these things. And it's also about that edge of like how it is dehumanizing us also at the same time. So I just wanted to include that here for the audience, because I know some of this audience knows my dad's stuff and all of that, and just trying to create a little context here for it. Because I think it is fascinating when you start to let yourself see that there are these kind of three worldview value systems that are essential in some ways. It's so interesting because the postmodern people that you and I run up against, and part of, I think, of the conversation we're trying to have with them, is this idea that conservative values, or traditional values that we like to talk about, have some actual value to them, and try to explain that, and beyond modernism, like medicine and food, and not scrambling for our our how to make a living, and we actually have freedom in the marketplace and things like that. I mean, obviously there's good things about that, but it is something that I find so interesting during this, what I call the Trump era, because he really has brought something into the conversation again, which is, he has so scrambled all of these values, and he's kind of got a little bit of everything in him in some ways. And he's definitely a huge reaction, and his followers are a huge reaction against postmodernism. I think that's the biggest thing that Trump brings to the table. But I do find it funny when during the first Trump term, I found myself rooting for Law and Order a lot. And as a postmodern, raised by counterculture, the police are not on your side family, to suddenly be rooting for, let's all agree that there are rules we should be living by, like red means stop and green means go. Is that true still? Because it seems that, when he came in, he wanted to shake up, and of course he is, in my opinion, very much a con artist who's a scam artist, basically. That's his use of modernism, and his way of making money is, to cutting all the corners he can cut in all the regulations. And he's bringing that set of ethics to the most powerful position on earth, one of them. And so this desire for that, and this desire for a sense of, I'm thinking about the other traditional values of not so much God or church, but that thing that happens when you go to church every week and you know your neighbors and you are connected and you have you're having the same conversation with them and you know that you agree upon something basic that's operating in the world. And I'm a big I want to feel that in the world too again. I think that's some of the frustration right now is that we don't feel like we belong together anymore, unless you think of the humans, the species, or sentient beings, or however you want to go, however wide you want to go. And so I find it interesting that it's when I talk to people and I bring some of this stuff up. And then, of course, there's the other side of it, which is the postmodern people. And I have to say, what's been so interesting since the election is I've noticed a lot more people who are on the left, who are progressive politically, really pushing up against the cultural handcuffing that the postmodernists, we call it political correctness, or DEI or whatever it is, just noticing a bit more on social media, some courage around that conversation that a lot of us in our homes have had nuanced conversations with and about for 8 to 10 years about all of this, but it's starting to leak out a little bit more. And I think something is moving, Steve. I think the left is, not the left, but the green, what we call the green or the postmodernists, that there is a little bit of crack showing in their inflexibility in some way.
Sure. Again, if we're talking about a cultural structure of values, that in a sense the edges are blurry. They sort of bleed into each other. But many of what we might call the pathologies, or maybe just shortcomings of this progressive postmodern political view, is that as it's become, especially over the last 10 years, as it's gained this cultural power that I mentioned, the tropes of being against, the tropes of antithesis, right? In other words, I mentioned the term dialectic, right? And one way of understanding that is the structure thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. That's kind of an oversimplification of this process, but there's a way in which there are, at every level of evolution, natural tensions can give rise, the tension energy can give rise to a new form of emergence. So when we're talking about the tension energy between postmodernism and the rest of the establishment truce that prevailed prior to the culture war, right? I mean, in other words, I mentioned the liberal consensus and how there was this kind of a cultural truce between traditionalism and modernism, but how when postmodernism emerged, it sort of broke that up and awakened the religious right as a force. So we have these structures, and we can see that postmodernism's its place in this larger dialectical movement is this in a place of antithesis, but that can only go so far. And so as postmodernism has realized the limitations, the frustration has caused them to, in some ways, regress. At least part of this postmodern discourse has regressed. And that is one of the ways that this postmodern worldview gained adherence and gained in some ways the moral high ground and attracted so many elites and captured so many institutions, is that they represent a more thoroughgoing world-centric morality than modernity. Modernity has a sort of formal, legalistic world-centrism, but with postmodernism, there's this awakening of deeply caring values. People care about the losers, about those who've been left behind, about those who've been exploited or oppressed. And this is actually a very moral move that I think we need to keep in mind, even as we critique postmodernism, is that this embrace of world-centric morality is a beautiful evolutionary emergence in its own right. And if we're going to make a better world, we're going to need those caring values, right? So that's one thing. But at the same time, that world-centric point of view, it's hard to motivate or mobilize people. It's hard to create social solidarity around something that's as abstract as world centrism, right? So it sounds good, but it doesn't trigger our evolutionary psychology, right? Which is deeply embedded in more of an ethnocentric outlook, us versus them, right? We have all kinds of biological structures that have been, I mean, I'm not a proponent of evolutionary psychology. I think it can explain some things, but certainly not everything. But it does explain a lot of the, the knee-jerk reaction that people have, or the tribalism that is, you can see at every level to some extent.
Yep.
But because world centrism was hard to get political will generated at that level, they've had to kind of go back and bring in ethnocentric elements, and that worked to get people outraged. Identity politics itself is kind of an ethnocentric move, and while that can generate lots of fury and passion and get people to riot, ultimately it ends up destroying the structures of world centrism that progressive postmodern, that was its major advance. So we're seeing right now a certain decay within progressive postmodernism, but that's evolutionarily not only predictable, but it's our opportunity into itself, right? So I said, this progressive worldview is not the end of history. Something comes next, and as it starts to decay and demonstrate its own limitations, that opens the door for us to consider what this dialectical process points to, and that is a synthesis, right? The synthesis carries forward the best and leaves behind the worst of the opposing structures and builds something more. It's not meeting in the middle. It's growing into a larger container that can contain both and can contain their challenges to each other. We're not going to have some kumbaya moment where we're just all putting down, the ways in which we hate each other. But what we can do is create a synthesis where we can understand the interdependence, right? We can understand that the traditional cultural values are civilizing. If we wipe those out, there's going to be regression. The prosperity and liberty that modernity delivers, another important layer. If we wipe that out, regression is where we're going. So we have to preserve these other structures, even in their transcended form, if we're going to create a synthesis that can reestablish the minimum solidarity necessary for a democracy.
Yeah, it's so interesting when, because you can kind of think about it with like physical evolution too. It'd be like saying, well, atoms, molecules, molecules can't be in charge anymore or something. Well, we need to go back and kill all the molecules. And then suddenly we're dead because we've killed all the molecules. It is this thing which we talk about in integral philosophy, and the whole evolutionary thing is this including and transcending is what you're talking about. It's like taking what works, taking what creates some real foundation for us that is essential in some way, but transcending the parts that are pathological or are destructive or are not working at this present time. And that growing pain, like the name of this podcast is called Humans on the Verge. It's this time where we're doing this growing into, or this waking up to a different thing that can be so difficult. And it's so interesting because when Donald Trump won the election in November, I thought to myself, oh, we haven't figured out how to integrate some of the parts, the values, the points of view, something essential here that its voice still hasn't been heard. It still doesn't feel included in the conversation in some way. And I know that's kind of a simplified way to think about it, but a part of me was like, oh, this is actually possibly a sign of, well, total chaos will come, or that these forces, these forces that are fed by these particular traditional modern and postmodern values, that this isn't about Donald Trump. It really isn't. This is about forces trying to get to be seen and heard and participate and synthesize, like you were talking about. And so I don't know, I have some kind of glimmer of appreciation and hope that this is at least our system here in humanity on some level trying to work out with these three kind of value-laden systems that we've been talking about. I think that most interesting thing that I find about when I learned about the word integral and what that means is that like you and I having this conversation, we have an appreciation for all of these value systems. We get that they bring something positive to the table. And at the same time, we also see their limitations. And what really woke my mind up, and like, I think that was when my little evolutionary brain went pop, boom, bigger space, is when I realized that when I'm stuck in I was brought up postmodern. That was my center in my family. But when I saw I was taught to hate the modernists and the traditionalists. It was the basis of being a counterculture kid. But as I grew older and obviously lived into my adulthood and saw that, well, I do too participate in capitalism on some level. I need to work that out. And I do have a deep, deep yearning for a connection with the numinous or the divine, that this is still a real thing for me. And that, basic institutions that kind of keep things stable in a society are kind of important things. You can't be in revolution all the time. And so when I was able to see that sometimes I was really stuck with an us versus them thing, but then when I understood that the integral perspective is one that sees all of them as important, whereas when you are inside your silo of postmodern or modern or traditional, which is where the majority of the people are, like you said, they can't see anything good in anyone else. They don't want to have any part of it. Like you said, the postmodernists think all of modernism is a nightmare and it needs to be destroyed. And I really do feel when I talk to people and I see people more and more that they really get that this change, this Trump era has forced us to see the wider picture and that it doesn't mean you're selling out or that you don't have a center of integrity or values if you can appreciate that all three of these worldviews bring something. What do you think is the percentage of people who are truly integral in their consciousness, postmodern, as you like to say?
Yeah. That's an ugly term, but it does describe what we're trying to participate in is this next significant emergence in history. I think that you mentioned the structure of emergence, that is molecules and cells and atoms and how they sort of, ideally they transcend and include each other, right? Cells have to have the right molecules have to have the right atoms. And when it comes to this structure of emergence, this idea of transcending and including, that's actually another way of describing dialectical development, right? If thesis, antithesis, synthesis is also the same as the antithesis transcends and the synthesis includes.
Right.
And that we can say that the degree of our transcendence is determined by the scope of our inclusion. If we don't include enough, then those lower levels are going to be able to nix the transcendence of the higher levels. You've got to, that is, if you don't have the right molecules, the cell's not going to be living. And so,
just briefly, I just want to say, so that's like the reaction of like I see MAGA as a huge reaction because it was not synthesized into the popular culture, and that postmodernism ran the media, decided to decide what's on TV, what are in films, and traditionalists never got included in that. And I see that there is, even though we call it grievance politics, there is this way, and it's like, hey, you've kicked us out of America. We feel left behind. We're the flyover states. We're not going to let this happen. We're going to raise our voice. And of course, this is all unconscious, but that's how I see that. That's that part that has not been synthesized. It's like, okay, well, we're going to make sure that we are heard and that you have to deal with us.
Sure. Oh, let me just say, I did not vote for Donald Trump, and I'm certainly concerned about him taking office here shortly. But I understand that people have, at least the people who voted for him, most of them, I would say, again, at an unconscious level, have assigned him to play the role of cultural bodyguard, right?
Yes.
The idea of making America great again is code for shoring up these traditional and modernist structures which have been in the crosshairs of progressive postmodernism. So the growing power of progressive postmodernism has almost predictably led to this backlash against that power. And so Trump's been elected to create destruction. And I think part of that destruction will be creative destruction, which is necessary for a healthy system, and part of it will be destructive destruction, which we'll, pull our hair out over. But,
Yes.
but the understanding that some of that creative destruction will be positive, and it's necessary in a democracy anyway, we can begin to see that underneath all of the attempts to creatively destroying the administrative state and all these other, wokeism, DEI, those are attempts to creatively destroy the unsustainable political power, cultural power of progressive postmodernism, right? So, in other words, until they can figure out a better way, until they're more synthetic and less in antithesis to the culture and the history and, the corpus of Western civilization, then the traditionalists and others are going to continue to send us Trumps to be bodyguards against the progressive postmodernism. Again, it's in the antithesis. But because there's little limiting principles, the limiting principle has to come from an emergence that goes beyond it, right? That is, as its negatives become more and more evident, this creates this pressure within this polarity to send in the cultural bodyguards, and obviously it's going to ruffle our sensibilities. It's going to scare us, and that's exactly why he's so appealing to those who feel like they need a bodyguard. If you're going to hire a bouncer, you want the toughest, ugliest guy that you can find. So again, I'm not trying to excuse it or say that there's nothing to worry about, but I'm just saying, let's look at it as taking the biggest picture we can and understand that each one of these worldviews are stakeholders in our democracy. They're not, they're not, we can't just pound a stake in the heart of traditionalism. And as long as we are alienating them, they're going to keep screwing us up. And so we can find a way to, some folks can never be included, but if we include their values, regardless of what they say, if we recognize that decency, honesty, respect for rightful authority, respect for our heritage, all of these things which traditionalism stand for, we can include those values in the synthesis safely without regressing to a pre-modern culture. And that one way of thinking about that is as cultural intelligence. Right? We had emotional intelligence. Everybody wanted it. Cultural intelligence is the ability to see these structures from kind of a outside and above perspective, instead of being pulled into your own tribe and digesting all the messages that want you to hate because that's in the political interests of the tribes. You can say, no, actually, everybody counts. I'm going to try to take a thoroughly world-centric perspective and recognize that unless we include, we're not going to transcend.
Yeah, that last line you said, Steve, is the one that always gets me, that if we really want to be in a world-centric perspective and really, really own that, then, and I think that's the easy step from the postmodern to the post-postmodern or to the integral. It's like, if you really want to own your world-centric cred, people, then you need to be able to look at every single person and say, they have value, and I am willing to include them in my circle of care. And I think that's the interesting moment of the Cheneys, that Kamala's campaign said yes to the Cheneys. Like, that is that. And yes, I get the politics of it. But that's the thing about the Cheneys too, is that the Cheneys stood for the most traditional thing, which is, this kind of bedrock values of the country, real traditionalism, like I think reading the Constitution for exactly for the words it is. There's no evolution in the Constitution or anything like that. And yet what, Liz Cheney standing up in for the January 6th committee and saying, this line is the line of democracy. Like, without this ability for this transfer of power this way, there's nothing here. It's all gone. So, that modernism of that agreement that we've made with the Constitution. And so it is fascinating to see the inclusion, like the attempts at inclusion, and of course the attempts at inclusion to get votes, to get power, I get that. But there is a way to see, and then you see the people who were in the Democrats, of course, and were like, I can't believe that Liz Cheney and Dick Cheney, and it's like, yeah, but these are people that have a certain voice for a certain thing, So I'm fascinated by all of this, and I love the worldview sitting out here on the back, or over up on Jupiter and kind of watching it all, and at the same time, terrified American. I would like some institutions to work, and I'd like my Social Security since I'm 61 now too, please. That would be nice too. But I wanted to talk just briefly here about what is it as humans. We're all humans on the verge, and here we are, humans on the verge together in America. What is one way in which we can, is there a conscious way to kind of move the evolution forward as a citizen or as a human being right now? What step can we take in this instance, in these next 4 years that we're going to be dealing with this chaos and all of this change and some dismantling going on? What can we lean into to help us navigate this?
Sure. Well, first, I would say a degree of confidence in the United States. The joke is that it was designed by geniuses so it could be safely run by idiots.
Fingers crossed, fingers crossed, fingers crossed.
In other words, for understandable political purposes, many in the media who are opposed to Trump want to frame it as an apocalypse. And again, certainly bad stuff's likely to happen. But we also got through the first Trump administration, and the Republic did not fail. And right. I have confidence the Republic's not going to fail this time either. But beyond that sort of trusting in the system to a degree, and trusting that a lot of, Trump's a showman, and a lot of his rhetoric is for show, right? In other words, if you're the bodyguard, the more trash talk you can do, the more that satisfies your base. But whether he's going to govern in that way or not, again, I don't want to speculate about it or be an apologist for him in any way. But what I do want to say is that each person in this moment in history has an opportunity to, if you'll pardon the cliche, become the change they want to see. And so what does that mean? If we need to grow out of the hyperpolarized culture war, one of the most direct ways that we can do that is as simple, really, is by expanding the scope of what you can value. Recognizing that at the bedrock level, the Trump's base, that there are some beautiful values there that you share if you're a reasonable human. And likewise, within modernity, instead of projecting or assigning the worst possible degraded, mendacious motives to your political opponents, if you can see their values, even while you keep their pathologies in mind, right? That doesn't mean you're going to stop objecting to, the things which cause you to take your political position. But if you can appreciate their values and even integrate some of their values into your own perspective, into your own political discourse, I think you'll find that people, the audience, will find that not only are they perhaps less freaked out about where we are, but that the ability to, even if you never are in dialogue with someone from the other side, just being able to appreciate that there's some good values there, and that there are things that are universal, and that these values, at least at the bedrock level, are partially interdependent, that provides a kind of a cultural perspective, this cultural intelligence, which can, again, give us a sense of perspective, give us a sense of hope, give us an ability to move from a boxing match to more of like an Aikido, move, so that you're working with the values of the other side. Another way of thinking about it is we talked about these polarities, like, you mentioned liberty and equality. Another one is grievance and gratitude. Right. So we have, those are interdependent values. And that is our ability to make things better by our grievances are partially dependent upon our support for some kind of gratitude regarding, the fact that the United States is still here, that we're still a free country, it's still a democracy. we can still work these things out. We still have free speech. So that is, if people are maximizing their grievance, if they just reject everything in sight, and that they condemn the United States and American society as irredeemably racist and just whatever, it's a genocide, whatever negative, just take it to the extreme. That's its own postmodern pathology. Indeed, the other side does it too.
Yes.
But the way in which we can recognize that our ability to deal with a situation, it's calling us to grow, and the more we can adopt this more synthetic view of the culture that everybody counts, and that in the future there will either regress significantly, or we'll grow out of it and come to a new potential renaissance. And I think that this renaissance is not inevitable, but it's not impossible. And thinking about it in terms of greater inclusion, right? How do we grow? How have we grown in the past? We've drawn the circle of inclusion larger. But postmodernism, this progressive culture, it's kind of, by the very nature of where it stands and the value that it's created and its kind of constitutional structure, it's unable, because it's in this stance of antithesis. So from within the progressive postmodernism, you're not going to really be able to find the moral resources necessary to draw the circle of inclusion wider, if in anything but a very superficial way. But
Right.
to do it in a more significant way, so that the other people feel that they're being seen and that their values are not being erased, but they're actually being honored and carried forward into this larger whole, that's drawing the circle of inclusivity in a way that will cause real cultural evolution and help us grow out of our current dysfunction.
It's so interesting. It's almost like a full circle for, you think about the basic values of those early religions that you talked about, those, the perennial wisdom, right? We talk about that, I have a friend who's a comedian, John Fugelsang, who was raised Catholic. His dad was a priest and his mom was a nun, and they met and they ended up leaving the church and falling in love and having John and his brother. But he was steeped in Christian values. And so he's a very lefty progressive comedian. And so he's always reminding people of these what he likes to call the real values of Jesus, that when you really bring that in, it is absolutely world-centric. I mean, that was the Buddha was world-centric, like all of these early visions of things. And then they got narrower and narrower. And so the ability to, just meet people with that perspective, like understanding that, your friends who may be Christians, they may have a very particular way they've learned those values and those ideas, and it's politicized over the years. But that's like one place where we can all meet in that language in some ways. And there's so many ways into this conversation with people. And I think the main one is I have found that if I feel myself knee-jerk reacting to anything, TV, news, a post on social media, whatever it is, I know that I am stuck in my smaller tribal thinking. Because if you're really in a world-centric perspective, you're willing to give anything the benefit of the doubt for the moment so that you can listen more deeply into what's trying to be said. And so, or see where the other person is coming from, maybe from their own knee-jerk reaction or whatever it is. But this has been my little kind of practice. Is like the minute I feel that wanting to like take the club and hit someone with it, or be terrified by something, I think, wait a minute. Something here is not letting me see the really, really big picture here. And honoring my knee-jerk moment, like, okay, I get that. I see what value is being stomped on right here, for sure. And what if I were to widen it to really see what is the dance going on here? And maybe I don't need to participate in that dance, because as long as we keep knee-jerk reacting each other in the world, this I guess it's thesis, antithesis over and over again, but there's no synthesis that gets to come in then.
Right. I mean, there are many oppositions that are permanent and they never get resolved, and there's no synthesis that occurs to transcend them. But when we look at history, we see that that process of synthetic transcendence keeps happening. At least, there's a pushing off and then there's a consolidation. Um, as Aristotle said, there are some things that are worth being angry about. That it's an appropriate reaction to be angry when something is very near and dear, gets destroyed, for example.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that cultural intelligence means that you shouldn't get pissed off about, the screwed up shit that's in our world. But obviously, the next step beyond feeling the trigger of your own value being, kind of connecting with your nervous system and your emotional energy, that can be channeled into something more positive in the sense of what am I angry about? What's the underlying value that's making me angry? And how can I make that value, instead of, allowing my anger to vilify the other person, how can I get that other person to see the value that's making me angry, right? You have to kind of keep going down and down and down to get to the more basic the value is, the more everybody can agree to it, at least has the potential to agree to it. So that's why this understanding of values and how values underlie the evolution of consciousness and culture in the world, this is opening up a brand new understanding of interiority, not just the interior of our consciousness, but the interior of our culture. These values aren't just individually held, they're held collectively. They form agreements which have their own evolutionary structure that builds. But, again, that's a big can of worms. But I can just say that I actually am, I see the danger that we're in, right, and the chaos that we're in as it could go either way, right? We could regress. I mean, we'll probably regress and grow at the same time, right? But the question is, which is going to gain the upper hand? I think it's not clear. I don't want to just sort of declare, unvarnished optimism, but I am hopeful. And hope is not so much a bet like optimism. It's like a virtue that you practice. Right? It's something that you have in your heart, and that can make you more effective in responding to the things that you hold dear, that you feel are being threatened. Because ultimately, within this cultural battleground, it's a battle of our hearts and minds, and that means that we have to understand this substrate, this bedrock level of values, because that's where the integration can occur. Right? The synthesis. It's much easier. The interests. The political interests, it's highly unlikely that those are going to be integrated effectively. I mean, we might have a middling compromise, but they're still going to be at loggerheads. Whereas at the level of values, as I said, because people with good sense and good faith can recognize those values, it becomes possible to integrate those. And once the values become integrated, the conflicts between the interests are significantly lessened. So again, in the book Developmental Politics, I lay that out as a political method of values integration, which has steps and examples and, it's its own practice.
Yeah. Everyone, please go get Steve's book, Developmental Politics. The whole second half is this part about value integration, learning about values, your own, others, the whole thing. It's a whole nother can of worms here. And Steve and I could talk probably for 6 hours and just scratch the surface on all of this. And Steve, I so appreciate how you have really articulated in your book and here today something that is just, it helps kind of take the fog off of our glasses, or helps us kind of make some sense out of all of the chaos. And it really does for me. It allows me to use my intellect in a way that helps me understand the world better, so that then my heart can do what it wants to do in the world, and that it can aim its care and its love and its attention towards things that I hope are here to help build up in people's connection with values. I mean, as a life coach, that's all I do is I work with people with what feeds them, which is their values, what are being served, and how to create more meaning in their life, And so this is the collective conversation about that. We need a life coach for America.
Sure.
And when I work with a client, I'm always working with all their inner parts, right? All the voices. Last month here on the podcast, we had Genpo Roshi talked about shadow and talked about all the different voices, and of course the transcendent, the non-conditional, unconditional voices. But I just want to thank you for just how well your life, your dedication to this topic, and of course it's obviously more than that. You've been completely abducted by it and you have no choice. But also just this particular new articulation, because I've been following you for a long time. But this newer book, this Developmental Politics, because you really, really take it to a different level, and especially talking about values. And you've really had me think more about virtues also, which I have to say, as a postmodern girl, that's a hard word to take and to swallow. It's like, virtues, what? That sounds so traditional. But once again, you are connecting us to and helping us, those who are on the integral train and trying to figure out how to be this integral thing, really embracing more and more of who we are as humans and what makes us tick. And it's such a valuable conversation. So I just want to thank you so much for being here today. And everyone, please go subscribe to Steve's YouTube channel. And I'll put it all in the show notes too. But he's got some great stuff on there, conversations that he has with all sorts of people.
So let me just say in conclusion that all of this is developmental politics, the book, and that's a political philosophy, but that's part of this larger integral philosophy that we've been talking about. And although philosophy may seem, it doesn't have a lot of prestige in the society at this moment, but if you look at history, like we talked about all the way back to the 5th century BC, all of these events of emergence, philosophy has played a significant role in all of them. And I think philosophy will play a significant role in the future. I've got another book. I'm working on it. I'm just kind of putting the finishing touches on it now, and it's going to go into the pipeline of publishing, so it won't come out for a bit. But that's a more generalized philosophy book about how ultimately the agreement about what's good can restore our solidarity, and won't lay that out here. But when the book comes out, perhaps you'll have me back and we can talk about philosophy, beyond politics, in a more general sense of the evolution of consciousness and culture.
Oh, absolutely, we will do that. But I knew I needed to have you on now because we need you. We need you, Steve. We need you to help us figure out what the hell's going on. We need you too, Kelly.
So we're in this together. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you again. And everyone, please support Steve. He's on Twitter. He's on YouTube. I'll put all of his links in the show notes. And thanks, Steve. Have a great day.
Thank you, Kelly. You too.